What if it's true, as Kevin Phillips recently stated in an article in Harper's, that ever since the 1960s, Washington has gulled its citizens and creditors by debasing official statistics, the vital instruments with which the vigor and muscle of the American economy are measured? What if it turned out that our individual, corporate, and government decision-making was based on deeply misleading, if not provably false data? That's what we're going to take a look at here by examining the ways that inflation and gross domestic product, or GDP, are measured. As you know, inflation is a matter of active policy. Too little in our current banking system risks failure. Too much, and the majority of people noticeably lose their savings, which makes them politically restive. So keeping inflation at a Goldilocks temperature, not too hot and not too cold, is the name of the game. Inflation has two components. The first is the simple pressure on prices due to too much money floating around. The second component lies with people's expectations of future inflation. If expectations are that inflation will be tame, they are said to be well anchored. If people expect prices to rise, they tend to spend their money now while the getting is still good, and this serves to fuel further inflation in a self-reinforcing manner. The faster people spend, the faster inflation rises. Zimbabwe is a perfect modern example of this dynamic in play. Accordingly, official inflation policy has two components. The first is regulating the money supply, and the second is anchoring your expectations. And how exactly is this anchoring accomplished? Over time, this has evolved into little more than telling you that inflation is a bit lower, or even a lot lower, than it actually is. The details of how this is done are more complicated, but worthy of your attention. Let me be clear. The tricks and subversions that we will examine did not arise with any particular administration or political party. Rather, they arose incrementally during every administration you would care to examine over the past 40 years. Under Kennedy, who disliked high unemployment numbers, a new classification was developed that scrubbed so-called discouraged workers from the headline data, causing unemployment figures to drop. Johnson created the unified budget that we currently enjoy, which rolls surplus Social Security funds into the general budget where they are spent, but then not reported as part of the deficit that you read about. Richard Nixon bequeathed us the so-called core inflation measure, which strips out food and fuel, which, as Barry Ritholtz says, is like reporting inflation ex inflation. While it was Bill Clinton who left us with the current tangled statistical morass that is now our official method of measuring inflation. At every turn, a new way of measuring and reporting was derived that invariably served to make things seem a bit rosier than they actually were. Economic activity was higher, inflation was lower, sometimes a lot lower, and jobs were more plentiful. Unfortunately, the cumulative impact of all this data manipulation is that our measurements no longer match reality. We are, in effect, telling ourselves lies, and these fibs serve to distort our decisions and jeopardize our economic future. So let's begin with inflation, which is reported to us by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, in the form of the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. If you were to measure inflation, you'd probably track the cost of a basket of goods from one year to the next, subtract the two, and measure the difference. And your method would in fact be the way inflation was officially measured right on up through the early 1980s. But in 1996, Clinton implemented the Boskin Commission findings, which now have us measuring inflation using these three oddities: substitution, weighting, and hedonics. To begin on this list, we no longer simply measure the cost of goods and services from one year to the next because of something called the substitution effect. Thanks to the Boskin Commission, it is now assumed that when the price of something rises, people will switch to something cheaper. So anytime, say, that the price of salmon goes up too much, it is removed from the basket of goods and substituted with something cheaper like hot dogs. By this methodology, the BLS says that food costs rose 4.1% from 2007 to 2008. However, according to the Farm Bureau, which does not do this and simply tracks the exact same shopping basket of 30 goods from one year to the next, food prices rose 11.3% over the past year, compared to the BLS, who say that they only rose 4.1%. Now that's a huge difference. One impact of using substitution is that our measure of inflation no longer measures the cost of living, but the cost of survival. Next, anything that rises too quickly in price is now subjected to so-called geometric weighting, in which goods and services that are rising most rapidly in price get a lower weighting in this CPI basket, under the assumption that people will use less of those things. Using the government's own statistics from two different sources, we find that healthcare is about 17% of our total economy, but it is only weighted as 6% of the CPI basket. Because healthcare costs are rising extremely rapidly, the impact of including a much smaller healthcare weighting is a reduction in reported inflation. By simply reinstating the actual level of healthcare spending, our reported CPI would be several percent higher. But the most outlandish adjustment of them all goes by the name hedonics, the Greek root of which means for the pleasure of. This adjustment is supposed to adjust for quality improvements, especially those that lead to greater enjoyment or utility of the product, but it has been badly overused. Here's an example. Tim LaFleur is a commodity specialist for televisions at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where the CPI is calculated. I'm guessing he works in a place that looks like this. In 2004, he noted that a 27-inch television selling for $329.99 was selling for the same price last year, but was now equipped with a better screen. After taking this subjective improvement into account, he adjusted the price of the TV downwards by $135, concluding that the screen improvement was the same as if the price of the TV had fallen by 29%. The price reflected in the CPI was not the actual retail store cost of $329.99, which is what it would cost you to buy, but $195. Bingo! At the BLS, TVs now cost less and inflation is heading down. At the store, they're still selling for $329.99. And hedonics are a one-way trip. If I get a new phone this year and it has some new buttons, the BLS will say that the price has dropped. But if this new phone only lasts 8 months instead of 30 years like my old phone, no adjustment will be made for that loss. In short, hedonics rests on the improbable assumption that new features are always beneficial and are synonymous with falling prices. Over the years, the BLS has expanded the use of hedonic adjustments and now applies them to everything from TVs to automobiles, washers, dryers, refrigerators, and even to college textbooks. Hedonics are now used to adjust as much as 46% of the total CPI. So what would happen if we were to strip out all the fuzzy statistical manipulations and calculate inflation like we used to do it? Luckily, John Williams of ShadowStats.com has done exactly that, painstakingly following each statistical modification over time and reversing their effects.